Hi, and welcome to another edition of Seattle City Club, Civically Speaking. I'm Alicia Crank, Executive Director here at Seattle City Club, and I am with Seattle City Council Position 8 candidate Tariq Yusuf. How are you, Tariq?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. Thanks for taking some time out. I'm sure this is a busy time for you right now.
Yeah, it is interesting because nominally anybody can run for office, but all of the work, the time, the energy that goes into that, and still having to do your full-time job and obligations with family and community and stuff like that. It's definitely a trial by fire in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So that's actually how we're going to start off. So who is Tariq? Like, what are you about? And why the heck did you throw your name in the hat?
My I'm gonna quote my campaign manager say probably because I'm a glutton for pain. But besides that, uh, for me, like I was born and raised in the Seattle area. I grew up most of my life in New Holly in South Seattle. I relied a lot on a lot of the social programs and different opportunities that were provided both by the city and our state. So I relied on I like New Holly is a Seattle Housing Authority project. I also relied on King County Seattle Public Health for all of my you know, WIC checks and had food stamps. I went to college with Running Start, and then went to the UW on Pell grants and other state grants. And so a lot of and what I ended up doing at the end is working in the tech sector.
Mhm.
I've been working in that for about the last decade or so. And so the question that comes from that is how am I not just another tech person that thinks that they can run for office? And the truth be told, I think there's a lot of people uh, that have a lot of the expertise that kind of shoehorn well into this. And the reason I'm running is not because of like what I did in tech or anything like that. For me, it's looking at the life experience that I've had growing up on social programs, growing up with that safety net that was below a lot of us growing up, and realizing how the city and the county, state, and federal government has slowly been eroding a lot of that.
Yeah.
And so I talk with kids that are in the same neighborhoods that I grew up in, and they're no longer able to uh, have that same access or that opportunity, or it's a lot harder, or it become more difficult to get a hold of the right people, or things like that. And it kind of frustrated me a lot. And I live in Fremont now, and I own a house now, fortunately. Um, but seeing that people that I knew, people that I grew up with, are still struggling, they're still trying to make ends meet. And a lot of what the city's been doing in the last couple of years has just been slowly cutting those programs, slowly cutting those opportunities for the, you know, some vague reason about economic reasons, or some vague reason about keeping business in Seattle, all while the people who were born and raised here and who've lived here for a long time are slowly being priced out or slowly being pushed out. One of the statistics I looked at when I was deciding to run is seeing that 90% of Seattle residents are white collar.
Mhm.
That means majority of your blue collar workers are coming in from outside the city. That's
Mhm.
your baristas, that's your waiters, that's your plumbers. It's all of these like trade jobs that like it doesn't make sense to have them coming from such a far distance away. Like my brother, he is a education director and imam that works in Skyway, and until recently, he commuted all the way from Arlington,
Wow.
multiple days a week.
Yeah.
Now it's a little bit better; it's in Linwood, but it gets to the point that we should be able to have everybody that works in this community also be able to live here. It creates a much more vibrant community. It creates a much more positive environment in the city overall. And honestly, I just kind of got frustrated at that and seeing constantly every year, especially kind of this last election, just seeing the slate of candidates that haven't really been talking about that problem. And it kind of got to the point where I said, if nobody's going to talk about this problem, maybe I need to be the one to talk about it. And so I said, you know what, we'll, you know, give it a shot. I'll tell the story that I have to share and what I think the city should do. And give
One
that
of
a
the things
shot.
I found interesting when I was going through your information, like your campaign principles. So empathy, justice, and equity. And of course, you have, I think there's two very polar schools of thought when it comes to these kind of things. So you have, ones that say, "Oh my God, yes, that's close to my heart," and fist bump. And then you have others that might be going, "Okay, those are woke words
Right.
or not really practical to what needs to happen with city council right now." So what is, I think the question I want to ask you is, what is your business reason for running for office? Because there's such, an emphasis right now on the budget, and especially the comprehensive plan. And there might be those that are very much invested in that, looking at this and going, but what does empathy, justice, and equity have to do with that? How
Yeah.
how will Tariq use that to address some of the current issues happening from the city council level?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think fundamentally this gets to, if I think of what should government be like, government fundamentally its job is to serve people, right? And
Mm-hmm.
everything has to kind of go back down to that. I think what we often see, and kind of the point that you brought up about, like, how we have this budget deficit and we have all the cuts that we need to make to balance the books. Those things are important, but that can't be the first reason that you make decisions. We have to think about what's the actual human impact, because local government, that's where the majority of people's interactions with the state as a entity, or the government as an entity, comes from. Like, you're not interacting with the Department of Justice, or you're not interacting with the Attorney General. You're interacting with the city workers that help keep our parks clean. You're interacting with the staff that work at Seattle Housing Authority. You're interacting with these services that are very, very local and very targeted and help people on a day-to-day basis. So as we're thinking about where are we choosing to spend money, we have to put that lens on of how is this actually translating to the individual person's experience. And my sense is that a lot of the ways that we're currently looking at that are less interested in how they're helping individual people,
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit more interested in how can we balance the interests to um, keep the city growing, for some definition of that. And I think sometimes we forget about how can we make sure that that standard of treatment is equal across everybody.
Right. And so I'm going to dovetail that into one of the things that you talk about when it comes to business taxation. So I think it's safe to say that right now the current council makeup is more business friendly than previous, and that seems
Mm-hmm.
to be celebrated by some. But I would also like to know from you kind of what is your thought on maybe what the current makeup is and how that would play into your being on council should you end up being elected.
Yeah, and I think kind of what you mentioned is right. There has been a hyper focus on the role of business within an organization, and the problem that we're seeing with that is that we're so worried about businesses being in Seattle, businesses moving out of downtown, and things like that, that we're forgetting there's actually a root cause with a lot of these reasons. Like, people are struggling. We have a massive number of unhoused neighbors that, I was taking the bus back home, and I was talking with a guy who's been homeless for 30 years and had his keys to his first apartment he got a week ago. Like, we have utterly failed that person. And as we're coming back from recovering from COVID, recovering from massive recessions in the past decade, and massive economic crises that have been not just in the macro sense, but also just like at the dinner table, affecting the cost of groceries and different things like this, that's where the focus needs to be. And I think the problem that we have on city council right now is that there tends to be a focus on the people that are speaking loudest, which are going to be the interests that have money. That's going to be your different businesses that have offices in Seattle, or companies like Lyft, or DoorDash or Uber, that are, like, I thinking specifically about the proposal to kind of cut minimum wage requirements for drivers. And I think that there is a fundamental disconnect that comes from there. And I think a lot of it, I think, frankly, as like being on city council for me would be kind of reminding the rest of the council, like, hey, our job is to serve people. Our job is to help people live better lives here in this city. Growth is important, but not if we're unable to solve the problems that we have here today. And kind of for the other side of the kind of more pro business people, the thing to keep in mind is once you serve the community, that business growth comes with it. Like businesses can't exist if there's not people there. Companies can't hire people and all the talented people we have here if they're not living here, if they're not living comfortably, if they don't have good schools, if they don't have good healthcare. All of these things kind of depend on the social infrastructure that the city has a lot of power to change.
So let's dive. So I'm going to now dovetail into another thing that we talked about when you talk about services and in public safety, and I know that's one of your focuses that you talk about in your campaign. And I found what you said here really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about how it goes hand in hand, and even saying police are overloaded with all these different responsibilities, but you say with vague mandates and minimal community oversight. What is your take right now on what's happening currently with the increase of being able to fund police with bonuses and so forth? Do you believe, is that something that you would have voted along with as well, or do you have any other thoughts around that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. To be honest, I would have voted against that because the problem is like we're putting so much money into police and we have a number of problems with the Seattle Police Department and the relationship with the community at whole. And instead of doing anything to actually address those, we're just kind of giving this massive pay increase at the expense of so many other social services, like Seattle Public Library. They had to announce more closures because those services are not getting funded. And so my perspective on community safety and community services goes hand in hand with what do people need. Like you think about, uh, right now, we have to think a lot of us who know the harms that police can have, especially on people of color and from people from low income communities. We have to think if we're going to call 911, what's going to happen as a result of that? Is an officer going to end up violently hurting this person when I just want to make sure that they get the help they need, right? And so we need to fundamentally transform this perspective that we have where not every solution needs to be resolved with an officer with a firearm.
Yeah.
There are many other root problems that come with that. Okay, this person is suffering from an opioid overdose. They need help to get medical attention and maybe get put onto a path for recovery. This person doesn't have a place to go and live. Maybe we need to get them connected with a social worker that can help them plan out how do we get you back on your feet.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the problem is we throw so many problems to the police to solve, but we don't really give any guidance about how to solve those problems at the core of where the issue is starting. A good example of this is the homeless sweeps, right?
Yeah.
Like sweeping people out, like where else are they going to go? You're going to push them out here. You maybe throw them in jail for a more expensive nightly rate than the Ritz Carlton, or you
Yeah.
push them to another uh, overpass or another park, and then you go and repeat this process over and over again. And like I think in 2022, I think it was, the city did 1,100 homeless sweeps, more than 3 a day or 2 to 3 a day. That is an absurd waste of resources. And imagine if we put all that money to, hey, let's send a bunch of social workers there to figure out what's the reason that you're here. What can we do to help? How can we get you back onto your feet? That's good for the people
Mm-hmm.
because it gets them into a position where they can be productive members of society that help their own families and communities. That helps businesses because more people who are employed, more people who have jobs will spend more locally, and that also helps like even the bigger businesses, because they're not going to have as many cases of where you have like different encampments and stuff like that
Mhm.
that they perceive are disruptive to the way they're operating. So
You
that
know, we
holistically is kind of perspective on
we
it.
ended up talking about that a little bit at our civic cocktail that we did for the month of May, which is around Mental Health Awareness Month. And so we had Amy Smith from Seattle Care, who really touched on a lot of things that you just mentioned. So I'll be curious to know, what is your familiarity with Seattle Care? How do you think they're doing so far? Do you think it's part of the solution?
Yeah, no, and I think we're starting to see like not just Seattle Care, but other models that we've seen in other cities like Portland. There was one other city I think on the East Coast that tried this, but you're seeing that as we have this more care oriented programming or care oriented response, you see that there's a less chance for escalation into violent conflict. There is um, less of a um, can't find the word I'm looking for, less of a reoccurrence rate of that same person being involved in a response call, and it produces better outcomes from the people there. So um, I think what the care team is doing is a fantastic thing, and I think we should work towards expanding those types of programs because, like, fundamentally, it provides a much more human face to when there's an issue or when there's a problem, right?
Yeah. So we're going to go back to money and funding, because there was something else that we talked that I saw your site that I want to talk about, was your approach around income tax. So I want to kind of give you some space to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and honestly, like as I've I went to study my master's at the UW in like in kind of with the focus of working in policy, mainly in the tech sector, but also in kind of related parts. And one of the things I was thinking about is, you know, how does it make sense to what type of funding model makes sense for running a city, for running a government? And I think part of what you have to think about there is who has the resources to solve the problem, right? And I think the approach that we have of like prioritizing on property tax or income tax, it puts a lot of that burden on individuals when the real place where all the money is being consolidated are the very, very rich individuals and the businesses in the area. And fundamentally, those are the entities that are benefiting the most from the infrastructure that we're building in the city. And those are the ones that are able to take the hit and actually help make the city better uh, instead of causing kind of a strain across everybody. And so my perspective is that we need to start prioritizing things like the social housing initiative. I 137,
Mhm.
5 or 7, one of the two, but like prioritizing the payroll tax to fund the social housing developer. Like these are solutions that can provide a much higher stream of income while right now not straining the individual with the cost of the cost of food, the cost of gas, the cost of rent, right? I work in tech, I make a decent amount, and the fact that it's still kind of tight for me is kind of jarring. I mean, I've been in tech for a decade and I haven't been in a situation where my money has felt tight. And so for everyone else in this situation, I'm thinking about, okay, who's not paying up?
Mhm.
And for me, that answer is the businesses, the grocery stores that are overcharging on essential items, despite the cost of food, actually producing that food, isn't that high. The cost of healthcare, you see record profits being made by private hospitals and insurance companies, but and like putting people into debt. And for me, I think that we could do a lot with just that without needing to put in income tax at all.
So, one last thing I want to ask you about before I give you the final word is about running in general. You know, we were talking about this offline, and um, not every city like a Seattle has democracy vouchers. And I've seen more people, maybe more, I won't say just Gen Zers, but in general, kind of seeing more younger people starting to even consider throwing their hat in the ring for something like this. And they probably wouldn't be able to if they didn't have, if Seattle didn't have this democracy voucher program.
Mhm.
How has that influenced your ability to decide to run in the first place?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic point, and I think something that is good to keep in mind is how much, just to run for any office, how much money is involved in that. Like we're fortunate in Seattle where we have a lot of kind of campaign finance limits that make it a little bit better. And I'll talk about that in a second. But I know some people that are running for state house or Congress, and the amount of money they have to raise is in like the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to challenge someone who's been there for a long time. Unless you have the deep network or the connections to go and do that, it's pretty much a shot in the dark. You have the exceptions like AOC, who ran like a campaign really well just by going and talking to people. But it's a lot of work and a lot of resources, especially while still trying to live and survive. What motivated my decision to run in Seattle is that one, the campaign limits are a lot lower. Any individual, any business, any PAC or anything like that can donate only $350, I think it is. That's the limit. And in addition to that, we have the democracy vouchers. The democracy, every Seattle resident, or any Seattle voter, or any permanent resident in Seattle can get these democracy vouchers that will come from a fund the city has and go and fund these people that are running for office. And at the end of the day, all that money goes back into the city pool. So if I don't use all the money that I have to give that back to the city,
Yeah.
regardless if I got that from democracy vouchers or otherwise. And what this does is it helps it helps a couple things. One, like I don't like asking for money. I don't want to have to go around and call friends and ask like, hey, can you give me 200, $300? Like it's uncomfortable, right? Instead, when I go and knock on doors, when I go talk to people in the city, I can actually talk with them about the issues and what's important to them. And then they can decide to give me the voucher without having to spend a dollar or a dime on their side. It's a way of expressing support that is proportional to what people want in the city. And I think that's such a valuable program because it lets us as candidates focus more on talking to people and really making those connections. And it helps to kind of mitigate the effects of big money in these races. You still have some things like independent expenditures and ads and stuff like that, but I think it makes it a lot less intimidating to start and to run, and it helps kind of relieve a lot of things off your plate that you're already thinking about.
Yeah. So I'm going to leave you with the last word with a two-parter. So one is, we know that this position is a citywide seat, but what area of Seattle, what district are you in? Even though you'll be representing the whole city, so you get a time to rep your neighborhood. But two, also, I want you to be able to talk about what is it that you would bring to council that isn't already there.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm living in Fremont, and so uh, I'm living in Fremont right now, and I grew up in South Seattle. And I think there's something really, like, if you know the history of Seattle, you can understand why that background is kind of important, right?
Yeah.
Because Seattle is still one of the most um, segregated cities across the historical red lines.
Yeah.
Like we have the whitest schools and the blackest schools in within a few miles of each other. And that, like, for a citywide position, you need to be able to bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And the fact that I've lived on both sides of those communities, I think is one reason why I was especially interested in this position. Because like I could run for my district here, but I'd have to advocate for just the people that live in Fremont or Wallingford, right? I wouldn't, it would be harder for me to advocate for people I grew up with that are still living in Othello and New Holly and Skyway. And so I think that someone that can bring that position of both sides of that red line is super important. And I think that's what we need for this citywide position. You need to have someone that can really context switch between the different challenges that everyone is facing and bring that all together. And I think for me, the answer there is we need to provide a better social safety net. We need to create a government that has a little bit more compassion towards its people and a government that's more responsive and accountable. Right now, I don't think city council really has that. That's something that's, I think, frustrating to a lot of people when they email or reach out to their council member, they don't get a response. And it's also important to be able to see, hey, my government actually cares about me. And that's what I hope to bring in city council so that it raises the standard across the city so that everyone realizes, oh, we should be able to expect much more interaction from our representatives, not just to see them once a year when they're asking for us to vote for them again.
And I fibbed. I have one more question. But it's based on something you just said, and I'm framing this from the. I feel like I've talked to a couple of candidates so far, and that common thing that I'm already hearing is lifelong Seattle. Like like I've been here since the beginning. That first
Mm-hmm.
memory has been in Seattle. Well, we have a lot of transplants here.
We do.
And so we talk about, here's my civically speaking engaged question for you. How do you connect with, or how should one connect with those that when they hear that kind of wording, they're like, well, I just got here, or I've only been
Yeah.
here for 5 years or 10 years. How do you get that voter slash potential voter invested in you and what you're
Yeah.
saying? Because I think for some that can feel somewhat off-putting
That's
if it's like,
true.
you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
I'm speaking
Yeah.
for myself as well as someone when I first ran for office, in a northern in Edmonds, and the first thing I would hear is like, "You've only been here 5 years. You've only been here. What do you know?" And it was almost like a disqualifier. And I think
Yeah.
there were others in the community that bristled at that as well. But I think that's also happening in Seattle, where you have
Mm-hmm.
people relocating or having to move from one particular area to the other. How do they resonate with the lifelong person? How do you convince them that your tenure as a resident is something that they should factor in?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. I think one of the reasons why that becomes such an important thing to me uh, is the identification and understanding of how the city has changed and the impacts that the explosive growth that the city has had on different communities. I think that like even if you lived here for like 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, like you've seen how the city has changed, and as you live in a place, you kind of start to understand here's some unique elements that kind of apply here. Maybe they're similarly shaped in other places, but there's a unique factor here. That's one thing. I think the other thing is also just connection with the communities that are here, right? If I moved here, like say 3 years ago to take a job in tech, maybe I don't necessarily understand the, the difficulties of like, the massive food desert we have in South Park, for example. I don't necessarily understand um, the, where the red line, like what the impacts of the red line long term have been here, and I haven't seen what has happened there. Maybe if I lived here for, like, and if you lived here for a bit longer, you can see how the policies and the decisions the city have made can impact that. So I think for me, my from my perspective, it's not because like I think I'm better. It's more the fact that I've seen how things have transformed and changed, and I can speak to those experiences because I've been around a lot of people that have been impacted by it. I think anybody could do this, but it becomes harder the shorter time that you're here.
Yeah. Tariq, thank you so much for carving out time. I know this is a busy time right now, trying to get everyone ramped up and ready for the primary. Hopefully, we will see you around one way or the other, because City Club is going to be doing a debate for this position during the general. So, good luck to you. Thanks for taking time out to talk with me and share with others more about who you are. So thank you, and everyone. We will see you at the next Civically Speaking. Take care.
Thank you so much.
And boop.